Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Mentor Mondays. We are so excited to see you again out there in the virtual land. And also for those of you who are going to be watching a little bit later, we have a real treat for you today with a new volunteer up to share a little bit about his career, his background, and kind of opportunities that he sees out in the workforce currently. So I would excited to introduce you to our mentor spotlight today, who is Mr. Paul Allen. For the adventures in his back pocket, so I'm excited to jump into those as well. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Allen. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Perfect. Well, I just got a little note that our audio is coming in and out, so I'm going to pause for just a second and see if we can get our audio back. But while we are waiting, because I'm sure it'll play back, those of you who have some questions already on deck. Oh, perfect. We're going to back up to the last part of his intro. But for those of you who already have some questions on your mind, feel free to go ahead and throw those in the chat. But I will make sure that we back up and let you know. All of our tech team back there is letting me know we're good. Okay, back up a little bit so you know how awesome of a mentor we have coming on and how excited we are to have him. So I'll just start over. Paul is an awesome lifelong student of technology and a lover of all things peanut butter. He currently works at Red Ventures, which we're going to learn a little bit more about tonight, where he leads a team of engineers who operate across the whole stack and use technologies like Node, TypeScript, Go, React, and many others. Coming from an initial career in banking and consulting, he is self-taught in code and has learned everything from experience, passion, and lots of experimenting. Paul and his wife live in Colombia, where they enjoy watching the amazing race and awaiting their next adventure. And I mentioned on the first intro that Paul definitely has some really cool adventures in his back pocket. So I'm excited to jump into some of those tonight as well. So take two, Paul. That was even better the second time. And I know everyone is even more excited to get to know a little bit more about you. So welcome to our Mentor Monday Spotlight, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Perfect. Well, those of you who are out there, Paul and I were just talking about some of his awesome travel. So I know we are totally code focused, but I'm excited to dive into those conversations a little bit later. But to start, Paul, I would love if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, your educational background, for sure, and kind of how you got into this world of technology.
Yeah, for sure. So my educational background is actually finance and banking. So I've got my undergraduate degree in finance and my graduate degree in finance. And so I went into banking and really enjoyed business and banking and spreadsheets, and really just enjoyed kind of like the puzzles of diving into financial problems and different things. And so I worked for banking for several years, and then went into consulting for a while. But all along the way, for me, technology has always been a hobby. It was a fun place to play around.
Yeah.
I use technology to like relax, I guess. And I really kicked into high gear, and when I moved from just loving technology to actually learning how to produce technology is when I was working on some stuff in banking, and I ended up breaking Excel because I kept trying to make Excel do things that it wasn't supposed to do. And so I was like, I feel like there's a better way to do this. So I ended up just like, I'm going to learn a couple things and just see if I can make it easier for myself. So I ended up learning Python, and like, this is a lot of fun. And so I went on from there to say, it'd probably be cool if I had a website to show all this stuff. So I learned, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and kind of learned all of that and started displaying some of these things. I'm like, this is actually a lot of fun. I wonder if I could build other applications. And so I literally just, in my free time, because I, wanted to relax, I would just learn things and build applications. And one of my first applications that I built was, my wife at the time was an elementary school teacher and had this paper easy grader that teachers use to calculate grade. And so I was like, oh, well, at the time, this has been about 10 years ago now. Like at the time, I had just learned some PHP stuff. I was like, oh, I'm going to build you an application. And of course, she didn't ask for that, but I was like, I'm going to build it. And so I built this application, and that application has just been like my application to continue to rebuild and rebuild. And so I just like had fun building all this stuff. And then a while back, this is probably 3 or 4 years ago now, I was like, I wonder if I can actually do some more of this professionally. I wonder if it'd be worth it. And so I looked into coding boot camps and a couple things like that. And it really, at the time, there wasn't SC codes. There wasn't really, some of the boot camps were there, but they were expensive, and I just didn't have the money or time to do that. And so I actually went to a bunch of universities and just asked and found all of their computer science curriculum and read all of their syllabuses and said, oh, these are the courses they take. And most of these courses are available like on YouTube. The professor just put the videos up. And so I just watched them and took the homework that he provided and graded myself and walked through the whole thing and just kind of learned all these things. And almost 3 years ago now, I had a friend that went to work at Red Ventures. So this whole time I've been doing stuff in higher education and consulting, and tech had still been very much a side business for me, or just kind of in the hobby. And so about 3 years ago, I had a friend that was working at Red Ventures said, hey, you should come work here. And at the time I was doing a lot of stuff in marketing, and I said, oh, well, in marketing, right? And he's like, no, come be an engineer. I'm like, oh, that's for someone with a CS degree or computer science degree. Like, that's not me. He's like, no, you like technology. You would really enjoy it. Just come on. And so I went to Red Ventures and had no idea what to expect. Ended up applying, and they're like, we actually want to bring you on as a mid-level engineer and eventually senior level engineer, because your code is much a lot more than what we see. And so come be an engineer. I was like, oh shoot, okay. So I backed myself into a job that I would do for free, but now I do professionally, and it's been a blast ever since, because it's something I love doing, and now I get to do it full time instead of like waiting to get home to do it. So it's been a blast doing that.
That is awesome. And I'm sure that our learners who are watching and who will be watching later can identify with that kind of self-taught spirit, because they are coming on our platform, obviously being led by instructors, but definitely have to have that passion and experience and looking for that expertise. So I really think you're a huge resource for the learners that are tuned in tonight. So totally exciting and inspiring to hear that. Would definitely love to pick up there and learn more about Red Ventures and what Red Ventures is as an organization and kind of your role there, which you touched on a little bit. But
yeah, so the first day at Red Ventures, they try and walk you through orientation to say, how do you answer the question of what is it that Red Ventures does? Because it's hard to explain, because we have a lot of different things happening. Kind of irons in the fire, if you will. So most people know us we do a lot of different partnerships and those type of things. But most people know us from a lot of the brands that we have products in. So if anyone's ever used the website The Points Guy for traveling, or bankrate.com or creditcards.com, those are all our brands. If you've ever used All Connect or reviews.com, those are ours. If anyone's ever familiar with cnet.com, a golden era of the internet, like that is now us as of a few months ago, as well as if anyone likes to travel, the Lonely Planet is now us. So we have a different brands that have a lot of different technologies that we use under the hood. And so me specifically, I work in our higher education vertical. One of our main sites, bestcolleges.com, is a part of our company. And so we have a lot of different products and sites within the higher education field. And so my job is I lead product engineering for the higher education vertical. So we have right now about 2 teams of engineers that work on different products. So we've got products that allow students to search for different universities and search for different schools and different programs, different things with career and financing and everything in between. And so my teams build products for that vertical. So it's always a fun question, like, what is it that Red Ventures does? And it's like, well, what do we not do?
Yeah.
Is the best question. But we've got a team now. We've got, man, I think it's between 800 or 900. It could be even more engineers, like an engineering core.
Oh, wow.
So engineering across the company, and which for me has been so cool because like everyone is like super excited about engineering, and sometimes you have to pull engineers away from talking about a problem because everyone just gets so excited about solving it. And it's like, hey, we actually need to do this other stuff. Like, but this is a fun problem to solve. Can we keep doing
it? That's awesome. And I guess in your role now, where you definitely still have a touch on educators and education, that easy grader came in handy. Who knew all those years later?
I know. And it was actually, and this is a good point, I guess, for anyone looking to go into the industry. It was that app, that Easy Grader app, and it's gradecalculate.com if anyone wants to go. It is
drop it in the chat,
shout out. Click on as many ads as you want. So it's actually that app that was a big factor. I came to find out later is a big factor in people in the company wanting to take a chance at me at a high level. So the information that I got from my recruiter at RV was, they're like, you look like a senior engineer. Your code is that of a senior engineer. The way you talk is like a senior engineer, but you've never been an engineer professionally. So it's a really big risk for us. And the only thing that the reason they kind of took a risk for me is because they got to see this application that I built in the wild. And it's doing really well. It gets like 40,000 users a month when it peaked. And so it gets a lot of people using it. That actually helped get me the job. That has been, a blast ever since. So like that project has, in more ways than one, has kind of helped me not only learn code, but got me the job in what I have today.
That's awesome. And kind of in the same, we got a request for the website. So could you shout that out one more time?
Yeah, it's gradecalculate.com.
Gradecalculate.com.
Yes.
Perfect. And so in that same vein, I'm curious then, what would you say to, and this is a question we get all the time, to someone who is looking to jump into developing and is afraid or doesn't know where to start, or is looking for like one piece of like tangible, this is something that you need to start with or have when you're looking to applying for jobs, like where, and that's kind of like a gamut, but what would you say to that person?
Yeah, so I think the one big thing for me, and everyone's different, and I think it's important to know that everyone kind of learns differently and thinks differently. But for me, the big thing was I wanted to not just, learn things. The appealing thing for me is not just memorizing syntax or how to write a language. The appealing thing is problem solving, right? That is the driving force. And so for the Grade Calculate app, it was not, I want to build this app that does grading. It was, my wife had a problem that she kept losing her easy grader, and it was frustrating for her. And so I wanted to solve that problem. Now I solved it in a fun way, but at the end of the day, that's what it is. And for me, like engineering, that's the exciting thing, is problem solving. And so starting at the base of like, what problem do I want to solve? And do I need to continue to break that problem up into smaller problems to eventually solve that? So for that app, as a good example, at the time I was like, well, I needed to be able to calculate these things. Well, how do I make it, show different things? How do I make it take user input? Well, to take user input, I've got to learn how to get user input, and that I need to learn how to show that in the website. I need to know how to take that on the back end. And so all these little mini problems that make up the bigger problem helped me to learn all the different components of something. So that would be my advice too, is, what's the problem you want to solve, and what's the end goal, and then keep breaking the problem down to solve it to the smaller things. Now it may, the timeline to solve those may be, a week, maybe a year, but that's the core of everything, right? Is this bigger problem just chunked into smaller problems that I learn enough to solve the smaller problem. Now I'll get into the next level. Okay, enough to learn that one. So eventually you get to the main problem that you were trying to solve.
That's awesome and great advice for sure. Awesome. So can you tell us, a little bit about, two-part question. Lessons learned, or now looking back on your journey, and I know that you've had a career change, which is great and really valuable for a lot of our learners who are also in the same boat. So what would you say would be some of your biggest takeaways or lessons learned, or I wish I would have done this or known this, that you could share with us?
Oh man, that's always tough to go back and look at your lessons learned across life. The big one, I guess, one of them was like, being okay with not knowing, and being okay to say that I don't know, and that's a normal piece of business. It's interesting. I have this love of technology, and that, I think ultimately the timing was perfect, but sometimes I wish, like, could I have gone into the industry a lot sooner? But a lot of things that held me back was just, this idea of like, well, that's not who I am. I'm not an engineer. Like, I know this stuff, but I probably couldn't do it professionally. Or like, oh yeah, I write this code, but it's definitely not a professional grade code or something like that. And, in some cases it wasn't. Some cases especially when I got into professional engineering, like, there were some things I'm like, yeah, I needed a lot to learn. I used to learn every day, but there were some aspects that I was far ahead than some of my peers. But I was always so afraid of, like, because I wasn't called an engineer, that I was not, in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm not an engineer. And I think for me, learning this distinction of the title didn't make me the engineer. It was the idea of like problem solving, and using the idea of problem solving makes me an engineer. And the idea of solving those problems with code makes me a software engineer.
Yeah.
Right. And I didn't need the title to be able to solve the problems and do it with code. And so I think a lesson learned was to, like, it's okay to be in that good state. And I've come to find out too, and with experience, that the best engineers know that and are okay with not knowing. In fact, it's often a red flag when you have an engineer who feels that they know everything and is not in an active learning state. And this is a pro tip for interviewing, because I do a lot of interviewing now at RV, is if you ever get asked the question, what are you learning right now? And you're like, well, that's actually a pretty big red flag for us, at least. Because if you're in engineering, especially software engineering, if you're not learning something now that what's on the horizon, you are automatically behind. A lot of the technologies we use today weren't invented 6-7 years ago. And so software engineering is constantly recycling and restarting, and new technologies are becoming core things. And if you don't have that space of learning, like, you're not going to go as far or have as easy time going there. And so I think for me, like, being okay with not knowing something, and being okay with, saying like, okay, yeah, I don't know that right now, but let me go learn it. Let me figure it out. I kind of wish I would have learned that earlier, and made that jump sooner. So I think that's the big thing. And I imagine a lot of people out there, especially if you're not coming through a traditional lens, like, is knowing that imposter syndrome is okay. And it's normal to feel like you don't belong. I feel that every day. When I remember vividly, I had the same feeling just last week. My team is building a new app and a new platform, and we're architecting this and across a bunch of different places. And I remember thinking, like, the team was asking me questions like, what do you think about this? And I remember thinking, like, why are people asking me? I've only been doing this for a while. and like I felt so like I had this feeling of like, man, I hope no one knows that I'm still, I don't know this answer off the top of my head. Now it worked out as a team. We all kind of were able to talk through. I'm like, yeah, what do you think? Like, let's talk through it. Let's solve the problem together. So I don't know, being okay with that and knowing that that's part of it, and like it's okay to feel that, but it's okay to continue on even as you feel that, right, has been helpful for me.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's really good info. I know we had some notes pop up on the screen too, so lots of gems being dropped in that for sure. Wonderful. So looking at the tech space as a whole, what do you see? And I know that this answer now is a little bit different with COVID, of course, but what do you see as opportunities that are on the horizon, opportunities just in general, things that learners on our platform should be looking out for as they are entering the workforce or kind of figuring out what it is that they want to do with this new skill?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the exciting things about tech is that it is, if you were to say, is tech on the horizon? Yes, everywhere and anywhere. The whole driving force behind SE codes is that as a state, we have to fill a lot of need. Companies need this, and so like the opportunities there. Some interesting trends I think that we're starting to see. One, there's always like buzzwordy trends, right? Like, Bitcoin and machine learning and AI, and those things are definitely there, sure, and they're exciting fields. But there's also tech in like the hardware space and robotics. There's tech in, and ad tech and web tech, which a lot of people might be familiar with if you've gone through a lot of the courses with JavaScript, the Internet of Things, and so, I think there are some really good things that you can learn up front. Like anytime you write code, these principles are there, and you'll probably learn them in your courses of writing dry code, do not repeat yourself, writing code that is readable and maintainable. Like those go across. But also thinking through like what are the areas that you want to specialize in and have more of a particular area. So like for me, so I would be classified as a full stack engineer. So I can write code all areas of the stack, but my specialty is, and I like to call it the middle stack, and it's really more on the and some other engineers have coined it the back of the front or the front of the back of the stack. So I operate a lot in front end code, but a lot of the code I write looks more like back end code. So if anyone's familiar with React or any kind of JavaScript frameworks that have a lot of state management, what we call, and a lot of logic that is baked within an application, but that code still exists in the browser, that's a big specialty of mine. And then also in like kind of the data layer or the initial API layer, it's where I write a lot of code. So I do a lot of like stuff with libraries and different things like that. So that's where I like to spend a lot of my time. So this idea of like specializing in certain areas is where a lot of the excitement is on certain jobs. And so there are always going to be jobs that are like, we need an engineer, and they pretty much describe like a whole tech department, but they want one person to do it. But then there are a lot of jobs that are hyper specialists. So I want someone to be a UI engineer to where they're doing like complex animations through CSS or JavaScript or something like that. So like I think those are some interesting things like in the industry that we're seeing. We're also seeing like that specialization is starting to really manifest itself, especially in what we used to just call like the web developer or a front end developer. Now that front end developer could be someone who specializes only in different types of markup, and specifically, especially when you start thinking about accessibility, web accessibility, there's a specialized way of writing HTML and HTML5. Same with UI development. And, we have whole engineers at RV that only specialize in this UI development. So they'll spend, 60% or 70% of their code is only CSS, right? Versus a front-end engineer or an applications engineer who might write most of their code in this front-end development, but they maybe only do JavaScript. They do very little HTML. And so like, and we used to just call that a web developer. Now that can be 3-4 roles, depending on like the size of the company. And so the specialization, we're starting to see it a lot, right? And we can spend hours debating like what's the trend, and there's always a lot of fun articles of what you should learn next. Is it TypeScript? Is it Rust? Is it Go? But at the end of the day, we see a lot of the specializations happening across, and all those languages are hot right now for sure. But the core kind of sticks around, right? Like those timeless principles will always be there. But I think for everybody else, is just learning where you want to specialize in.
It's a ton of awesome information. So cool. Good to know. I know that we actually have a question in, if you don't mind. So I just found it. Where'd my question go? There we go. So as we are opening the floor for questions, I am curious if there's anything that sticks out in your head of like before I forget, or make sure you know this, any info that you'd like to share as I'm gathering those questions for you to answer. I know you just shared a ton of really great information, so thank you for that. But anything that you want to share, I know we have some questions coming in, so I'll open the floor to you and also open the floor to questions from our viewers.
Oh man, anything. There's so much. Like, I think for me, the biggest thing is just being passionate about learning. And so like, I always drive my teams, and the big thing I hammer on my teams is, I call it a learning plate, for lack of a better term, but I'm always telling people what's on your learning plate. And if you don't have anything on your learning plate, what is it that we should put on it? You should always have an answer to the question, what's on your learning plate? So obviously for someone that's just learning, there's a lot of things on your learning plate. But it's important never to move out of that standpoint. Because I guarantee you, like, again, I tell my team all the time, like we were heavy in React development. React didn't exist 6-7 years ago, 8 years ago now or whatever. But now it's like a core technology that we have multi-million-dollar systems backing it, right? It didn't exist. And if you were in like 10 years ago, you're like, I've reached the pinnacle of development and you're not learning this, you are now behind. And I see it all the time when I interview people that haven't learned in 3 or 4 years. And it's kind of like, hey, that was what we did 3 years ago. I know that moves fast, but that's just the state. And so what used to be a best practice is now an anti-pattern. And that's just the pace of sometimes how we move, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
That's something that we just got to keep going. So like having a stance of like learning and always learning is going to take you far.
Wonderful. Which is why you're here and at SC Code. So that's perfect. Paul is basically endorsing us again. Let's see. So we have some questions from the floor. So I'll start with Bo Farish. Hi, Bo. Thank you for watching. Bo would like to know, what do you remember most about your first 6 months to a year as a professional engineer?
Oh man, I remember my first day. I was scared out of my mind that someone would realize that I didn't know what I was doing, and that they would like immediately let me go and be like, oh, what a mistake. I was imposter syndroming hard that first day. But it was so interesting. I remember we were doing some dev setup on my local machine, and we were setting up the development environment, and we were running into an issue with a bug of like setting it up. And I was just like patiently waiting, and I was like so scared to even say anything. Like, I don't want to open my mouth, don't let them know I don't know anything. And it was so crazy. We were running this bug, and the engineer that was walking me through it, I was kind of like, well, actually, what if we did this? And they're like, oh yeah, that's totally it. And so like, I was like, oh, all right, okay, I know something. All right, I feel a little bit.
A little shoulder brush. I like
it. So I don't know, like that first day, man, it was like both equal parts, like so excited, a sponge shaking it all in, but also just, scared out of my mind. But then like once I got past that initial shock of like, oh no, okay, I can be here at least where I'm learning really good. and learning quickly. Like I remember then just being like an addict that's been loosed into his vice, and I just learned. I soaked it up. I learned so much. Like I would go in every RV is really cool that we have a lot of open meetings and stuff. I would just sit in other people's meetings and be like, "What are you doing?" And learning about their talk. I walked through. I stalked so many people's code and just learned so much. That first 6 months was great because, I was still figuring myself out. The company was still figuring me out. And then eventually after that first 3 or 4 months, then I got moved to be a senior engineer and then eventually lead a team. Cause then they realized I had management experience previously. They're like, well, we need you to lead some teams and help be a senior engineer. But that first 3 months, I just was so I learned so much, just diving in and I literally had like a blast. I was a kid in candy store, learning so much in that. So I remember that about my first time there. And I remember too, now thinking back on it, like how much, even in the span of being a professional engineer, of how much the code has changed. So the code I wrote on my first day, which was considered very much a best practice, if I were to go back and rewrite that code now, and this is even just 2-3 years ago, is now not, we wouldn't do it that way now. And if you did it that way, you'd kind of be like, I don't know, that's a little rough, buddy. So I don't know, like just how fast it has changed in that short time.
Awesome. Let's see. Another question we have in from Benjamin Vaughn. Hello, Benjamin. Thanks for watching. Is do you have any tips for finding bite-sized problems for different levels of ability? I've tried to learn by solving what I thought were bite-sized problems and got stuck by the amount of what I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very real challenge, and the downside is that never goes away. Like I encounter that every day professionally, and the biggest advice I have for you is to solve it the way the way we solve it professionally now is as you get to the point you realize, okay, this problem is still too big. I need to chunk it down even further, and continually chunking it down as best you can to kind of figure that out. So, especially in like broader core concepts of things, like I remember trying to learn how to do something with some API down the road. Like I was, hitting this API and getting information back, but I wanted to do something with the information and it was fairly complex. And I was like, well, how do I start thinking through this? So I started writing down the steps of, okay, what do I need to do to get to where I need to be? And that helped me to say, okay, well, all of these steps is something I've got to learn. Well, this step one was something I still didn't know. I was like, okay, let me break step one down see if I can break it down into smaller problems. And then, step one had parts A, B, and C. Like, well, part A, well, shoot, I still don't know how to do that. Can it be broken down? And eventually I broke it down. I'm like, okay, I can do that. I learned how to do that. That helped me solve this, and it moved it further in. And so that's the biggest advice I can give to you is to continue to, if it's still too big or like still past that skill gap, like continue to walk it down. Like, okay, what do I need to solve? What do I need to solve? And sometimes it means, okay, this is still, still not there to where I can solve it fully, but maybe there's a, solution that's already built that helps me solve this harder part, and I'm learning a little bit on this easier part. And then eventually, then I can get to a skill level where I can replace that harder part with some of the learnings I have. So, it's definitely a challenge, and it's something that you'll continually like wrestle with of like, man, how do I continue to break these problems down? I literally had this today. We were presented with a problem on a product, and off the top of my head, I was like, I don't know how to solve that. And so the team literally and we got together and like, all right, this is what we need to get to. No one has any like direct solves out of the box. Let's spend the time, let's break it down. Like, what do we need to solve? And so the team worked together like, well, there's this part, and this part. I'm like, okay, what does it take to solve this part? And then two of the parts we were able to solve pretty well. The third part, we need to actually break down a little bit more. And so like, that's just a habit and skill that will be really good for you.
Very nice. Thank you for that. We have another question in. You're killing it with the answers. Valerie Bowens, thank you so much for watching, wants to know, is it considered best practice to learn/use Sublime HTML?
So I guess, for me to understand the question a little more, so imagine so if you're using Sublime as a text editor, it itself has some things that come with it to make it a little bit easier, some plugins. I'm thinking that's the question. So I'll answer that. If it's not, put it back in the channel and I'll get to it. But so Sublime is a good text editor for sure. And I would say the big takeaway is to kind of learn what the power of a text editor, or you also hear them called IDEs, or integrated development environments, to learn how they can make things work, make you work smarter, not harder. But also, sometimes the text editor can provide too much power on your earlier learnings, to where it's doing some things for you that you should learn how to do first before you do it. That's what, sometimes in school you learn how to do the calculation before you're allowed to use the calculator, because the under the hood things that you're learning are really helpful for core concepts down the road. And so I think Sublime is a really good editor to learn and some of its things. I would say probably the more popular one right now, and this is, again, these are getting into more preferences and things. The more popular one right now is VS Code. And it's got some really great extensions that are easy to install. And then Atom is also pretty popular. But I would say in general, it's helpful to understand what your text editor can do for you, and those keyboard shortcuts that make writing code that much easier, a little bit more. We kind of call it code ergonomic. If I'm writing the same line, but I can map that to a keyboard shortcut, or I can write one key and it repeats that whole line, then I've saved myself a long time, a lot of time. So I think that's the big takeaway there, is not necessarily you don't have to learn specifically one editor, but it's good to know an editor and kind of what it can do for you, so you can, be more efficient.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Valerie, if you'd like any more information on that, feel free to drop it in the chat. Another question for you, Paul, just came in. Can you talk more about your transition from being an engineer to managing a team of engineers? Were there any pivotal moments or experiences that led you to make that career move? And I wonder if you could maybe touch a bit on your career prior to this one. I wonder if there's a clear transition or moments that connect there as well too.
For sure. Yeah. So prior to going into engineering, I had, a career in banking where I managed a good number of people. I also did some consulting that had some management aspects. And then right before I was in marketing and higher education, I did some managing as well. So when I got to engineering, it was really interesting and weird for me to move out of a position of leadership and into more of just an individual contributor role. And so, which is kind of the opposite of a lot of people in engineering. A lot of people in engineering will be individual contributors, then go into management. I had been management and then went into individual contributing. Mm-hmm. And then the company realized I had management experience. And so I got also put into a leadership and management role. And, I've just, by schooling and by experience, I had more more experience with management than a lot of my peers at the time. And so I got put into that role. But it was really good for me because I still got to keep my hands pretty close to the code. One of the main reasons I did a career switch anyway was to be a part of the code. And so it was really a lot of fun getting to do a lot of that, leading the team, but also getting to write a lot of code as well. I think the big thing for me that's been really exciting out of that is being able to mentor other people, both from a code aspect and helping, helping people that are still earlier on their journey in the same journey that I'm on, but also then helping people from a management standpoint which has been really natural for me in other careers I've been in, to help them build their career. And so for people in engineering that have never been a part of management, helping them think through yeah, you want to write this piece of code. How does that help us as a team? How does that help us as a business? And so that's been really exciting, getting to do that part as well. And now that I lead kind of multiple teams and have kind of senior leaders on my team that are leading their own people, it's a new level of management for me. It's a new area of code development for me. And so I don't do as much like feature code writing anymore, direct feature, but I spend a lot of time like thinking through broader strategies, thinking through the architecture, or through like different problems that are kind of maybe not quite so straightforward to solve. So one problem that my team solved recently was, how do we get better visibility on errors that are happening in our code, and how do we surface those to a broader group or something like that, right? So, but it's definitely managing and being an individual contributor are different things. And so when I became kind of a leading engineers, like having to kind of flip the switch a little bit and think through like, okay, how do I help someone learn this, or how do I, guide someone into a code decision or a career decision or something like that. So it's been a blast getting to lead other engineers and to be on a team of smart people. And I never like to be on a team where there's not people smarter than me. As weird as that sounds to say, I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. And so I look for people that are way smarter than me and have them on my team. And that's so exciting to be a manager of people that like are way smarter than you and to not only learn with them, but also work with them to help get to a common goal. So that's been a blast for me, but it's different. So if anyone's in that position of like, I've been just leading and doing my own thing, now I'm maybe managing or I'm mentoring or something like that. It's a different switch, right? Because sometimes you just want to go in like, just let me do it. I can do it in 5 seconds, and we're going to take a day to do it. But it's also helping them. Like a lot in our industry, we always complain that there's not enough senior engineers to go around, but then we don't take the time to work with junior engineers to become senior engineers, and then wonder why we don't have senior engineers. And so, when you're leading people, like take that into account. Like you didn't start as a senior engineer. You always got to that. And so when you're leading other engineers, it's helpful to keep that in mind of like, don't be frustrated when someone doesn't know what you know, because there was a point that you didn't know that either. You had to learn it. And so maybe that this is their inflection point to learn the thing. And so it's just a different mindset of how you approach problems.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Another question came in. If you had to choose, what is number one priority for job hunting / hiring? Profile site, GitHub profile, resume, or interview? Thanks again for doing this. And I think he's echoing what we're all saying out there. Thanks again, Paul. This is such good info.
No, my pleasure. So I'll caveat this with, I'm not a recruiter. And so if a Red Ventures recruiter is watching, please don't hold this against me or slap me later.
We'll put a little disclaimer in the box.
Thank you. So, all right. So the big thing really, especially when I interview someone, really like code is foremost, right? So can you think through a problem? Can you write the code for that problem? So there's a lot of cases where you'll go through interviews and you'll have like a code challenge, or you may have to think through a solution on a whiteboard or something like that. And so I would say that's a big deal when you get to the interview stage, right? Is that interviewing code chops, for lack of a better word, right? Being able to articulate your problem, being able to articulate how you're thinking about that problem, and then be able to kind of walk through how you would write that in code. And your code is king. I'm a great example of like, I didn't have an engineering job and my code is what got me the job, not my previous experience, because I didn't have any experience in engineering. So your code is king. Resumes are still important, especially kind of those initial bits. But I don't see the resume until after I've actually interviewed someone and walked through their code, especially when I'm reviewing a code project or walking through. I typically will not see their resume until afterwards. And so maybe I know the name, maybe not, but typically I'm primarily looking at your code and how you're problem solving. So that's a big thing, and every company is different. So it's tough to generalize, but having a site like where you can display your code, especially if you're getting that first job, because the company can't rely on your experience some other places. They've got to see your code somehow. So it's so clutch to be able to see how someone's code looks. So I absolutely look at people's personal websites and portfolio websites. And pro tip, your portfolio website needs to be some of your top end code versus the projects in your portfolio site. I've seen some people that are like, look at my great projects, but then their portfolio site itself is pretty rough. Like sometimes engineers take that and like, oh, this should actually be better or something like that. So I absolutely look at your portfolio site under the hood. Like I open up the code and look at it directly. So I think that's important, especially getting that first job, is demonstrating what you can do with code, and demonstrating more than just past like tutorials or things that you've walked through, right? Like, and that's why it's so clutch of like finding a problem that you want to solve, because not only will you be passionate about it and do a really good job, but then it also has a great story behind it. So I think there's those aspects. So they're all important, right? GitHub profile, it's important. I think the biggest advice I can give to you on GitHub is take advantage, if you can, of private repos. So sometimes people will have like half-baked things in their code on GitHub and maybe might not be a best reflection of the code you write today. Like I went back into my GitHub and there's a couple things I wrote like 10 years ago. I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna make that private. I don't want anybody seeing that code, especially a professional recruiter. But it's a great way to see your code. Like, we only have a few options to see you write code. And, if I have many examples, it's super helpful. So I would say definitely like, your code through GitHub or portfolio site, the interview piece, and then like your resume kind of back on it. Like it's important on the resume for sure. Don't have any typos and everything that's normal in a resume development. But especially in the tech world, like you take kind of the resume with a bit of a grain of salt. Like it's easy for you to say, I know JavaScript and these 5 other languages, than it is to demonstrate that you actually have written production code in those languages. And so a lot of people are like, oh, I'm really good at JavaScript. And then we get down to actual JavaScript problems and the code kind of betrays, what they are actually good at. So that, make sure people can see your code and what you've done in your work. And it's always helpful if that work has a story to it.
Awesome.
I don't know if that's the best advice, but that has been my experience in the engineering space for sure. But it'd be helpful to ask a recruiter to see if they have the same feelings.
Yeah. Well, as someone who, I know we just put out a call for final questions, but I had a thought. As someone who has interviewed engineers, have you had a story or had someone who like stuck out in your head, or someone who, when you hear that question, you're like, oh yeah, this person and this is why? Can you share like who they were or what they did to stand out to you, as not a recruiter, but someone doing the interview and review?
Yeah. So I had one guy who I ended up interviewing, and his code was really great. His projects were really great. Actually had a really good experience. He challenged a little bit on his communication, and I think that was just part of nerves and a couple of things. But we're in the kind of the feedback section afterwards, and some comments like, I don't know, doesn't know if he'd be a great fit, doesn't seem to communicate well. And I kind of piped up. I was like, well, let's look at the code. Let's look what he's able to do. He's got a passion for developing and learning, but he's actually got really good code. The communication is a little bit of a challenge, but we can work on that. But he's an excellent engineer. So ended up, we brought him on, and he's done really well and has done some really cool things at RV, and has developed some really cool products. And but that would have not happened selfishly, for the company would not have benefited from that. And then me selfishly as an engineer would not have benefited from some of the cool things that he's done and learning
Yeah.
from him had I not had such a stance on like, well, let's kind of look at the code first and look at what he's able to produce. And we also have a little bit, personal fit with a company. Does it make sense for the company that you're working? Like, you kind of vibe from a personality standpoint? Because not every company is for everybody. But like that code kind of carried him through. And the opposite has been true. There's been people that on paper looked amazing, and they're like, oh man, this guy's got 10, 15 years experience of this code and these frameworks, and brought him in and really challenged on just basic questions. And like the resume was the surface level, but it betrayed like what actually that person could do and how they could. At the end of the day, they were challenged with just solving problems and articulating the way they solve problems. And so, the code is kind of the thing that is the final test. So, like, you could have a great resume, but if you can't do the code, like write the code, then it's a little bit of a challenge.
Wonderful. Which is, I think, an appropriate place to pause as SC Codes. It looks like everyone is still chewing on all of the information that you've shared. So we don't have any other questions coming in, but I just wanted to thank you again, Paul, for sharing with us and sitting down and letting us pick your brain for a bit. This has been super, super informative for me. And I definitely think the same for our learners who are listening as well. And maybe people who are interested in mentoring with us or coming on in a volunteer role or coming on in another role to support us as a community. So thank you so much. I'm getting lots of wonderful jobs, great jobs coming in as well. So thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for letting me come on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if we don't have any other questions, I will stay on for a few minutes just to see if anyone else has anything they'd like to share. But if not, Paul, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone who is out there in SC Codes Land, thank you so much for joining us for another episode like we're a TV show, another edition of Mentor Mondays. We will see you probably in the new year with another wonderful mentor to share with us. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.